I've been waiting to read this with you.
I'm so glad you're here.
Always. Now, where were we?
The part about the stars.
Our favorite. I'll read it.
He was the most feared man in Seoul, and every single afternoon, without fail, he sat beside a hospital window and read love letters to a woman who had no idea they were hers. The notebook was worn at the corners, the ink smudged in places where rain had caught them unprepared, and every page contained a version of himself that only she had ever been allowed to see. The cruelest part? She laughed at all the right moments. She just didn't know why. Here it is. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that losing them felt like losing yourself, this story was written for you. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're just getting started, and trust me, you cannot afford to miss a single chapter of this. The thing about power is that it lies to you. It whispers that once you have enough of it, nothing can reach you. Not grief, not longing, not the particular specific agony of sitting 3 feet away from the woman you love while she looks at your face and sees a polite stranger. Power promises invulnerability and then has the absolute audacity to let you fall in love with someone in a bookstore on a Wednesday afternoon during a rainstorm, as though the universe has a personal grudge and excellent comedic timing. Kang Jae-hyun had built his empire on the understanding that sentiment was a structural weakness. He had watched other men at the top of Seoul's underworld crumble because they hesitated, because some softness in them flinched at the necessary moment. He had promised himself, at 22, standing over the wreckage of a rival's operation with blood on his knuckles and his father's exhaustion still fresh in his memory, that he would never be that man. He would never give anything or anyone the leverage of his attachment. He kept that promise for 4 impressive years. Then April happened. Then the rain. Then Osora Books and its absurd narrow storefront in Mapogu, crammed with volumes that leaned against each other like old friends at a reunion. Then a woman shelving Neruda with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long ago decided that the world's urgency was not her emergency, who looked at the most powerful criminal in Seoul standing in her doorway dripping on her floor and said, with magnificent disinterest, "Towels are behind the counter." He had not known what to do with that. His entire professional reputation rested on people doing the opposite of relaxing in his presence. He inspired renegotiation of debts, sudden clarity about outstanding obligations, urgent recollections of previously forgotten information. He did not inspire towel offers. He stood there, genuinely at a loss, which was so unfamiliar a sensation that it took him a full 7 seconds to locate the counter. Her name, he learned over the next 47 minutes, during which his driver sat outside in the car developing strong opinions about loyalty and over time, was Amara. She was finishing a graduate degree in ethnomusicology, which she explained as the study of why music matters to people, in which Jae-hyun processed as the most beautifully useless thing I have ever heard, while simultaneously wanting to understand every word of it. She had a way of speaking about her research as though the world's greatest tragedy would be leaving it unfinished, and he, who had spent years in rooms full of men performing manufactured importance, found it startling to encounter something genuinely worth caring about. She did not ask what he did for a living. He suspected she had assessed his suit, the driver visible through the window, the particular quality of stillness he carried like a second skin, and made an informed decision to stay in her lane. He respected this enormously. Most people, when they sensed danger, performed either aggression or extreme, overcorrected friendliness. She did neither. She shelved her poetry and let him exist in her space without making it a whole event. He came back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. By the fourth visit, she had started setting aside books she thought he might read, which he found both touching and slightly alarming, because the selections were accurate in ways that suggested she had been paying considerably more attention than her unbothered exterior implied. The first book was a slim collection of essays about cities. The note tucked inside read, in handwriting that tilted pleasantly leftward, "You look like someone who thinks about what things cost. These are about what cities decide to forget." He read it in one sitting and came back with annotations. She laughed so hard at his marginalia that the store's one other customer left, presumably fearing some kind of emergency. Jae-hyun, who had not made someone laugh like that in recent memory, genuine, unguarded, delighted laughter, the kind that has no audience, sat across from her at the small table near the window and felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates adjusting to a new configuration. This was, he understood even then, extraordinarily bad news. Seoul's underworld ran on ruthlessness and the reliable absence of personal vulnerability. His lieutenant Su Jin had once told him, with the frankness of someone who had known him since before Changwol, that his greatest professional asset was that no one could hurt him through attachment because no one believed he had any. "You're the safest boss in the city," she had said, not entirely as a compliment. Nothing to threaten, nothing to lose. He had agreed. He had been, at the time, correct. He was no longer correct. 17 months later, he would sit in a hospital in Yongsan beside a window overlooking a garden that Amara could not see from her bed, open a worn leather notebook to its first page, and begin reading her their story in a voice kept carefully, professionally steady, the same voice he used in negotiation rooms, the only voice he had left that did not shake. But that comes later. First, the cherry blossoms. The restaurant in Hongdae where the owner learned his order without being told. The notebook she pressed into his hands on a rainy Tuesday, saying, "Write things down, the good things especially. Those are the ones that disappear." He had smiled at her then, not yet knowing how precisely right she was. He should have written faster. If you believe that love can survive what memory cannot, that the heart holds what the mind loses, drop a comment below. And if you think Jae-hyun should have told her the truth from the beginning, say so. Only the Seo faction would stay silent. There is a particular kind of torture that has no name in any language Jae-hyun had ever studied, and he had studied several, not academically, but practically. The way a man learns what he needs to learn when survival requires fluency in multiple forms of pressure. He knew the torture of waiting for information, the torture of betrayal from someone trusted, the torture of a negotiation designed to humiliate before it conceded. None of them compared to this. This was sitting 3 feet from Amara on a Tuesday afternoon while she laughed at a passage from the notebook, their notebook, filled with her handwriting alongside his, and watching her turn to him with bright, curious eyes and say, "Whoever wrote this woman sounds absolutely ridiculous. I love her already. What happens to her?" He had paused exactly 1 beat before answering. "She becomes the most important person in the story." Amara had smiled at that, the particular warm smile she gave to things she found genuinely pleasing rather than merely polite, and turned back to the page. She did not notice that his hands, folded in his lap, had pressed together hard enough to whiten his knuckles. She did not notice because she was not looking for it. She had no reason to look for anything from him except a pleasant afternoon volunteer who brought decent tea and read beautifully. He had become, in the clinical estimation of everyone who worked for him, dangerously good at pretending. The hospital was a private facility in Yongsan, the best in Seoul, which went without saying because Jae-hyun had personally ensured its renovation funding 3 years prior through channels that the board of directors preferred not to examine too closely. Amara's room was on the 4th floor, east-facing, with a window that caught afternoon light at an angle that turned everything briefly golden around 3 o'clock. He had requested that specific room. He had told the attending physician it was for optimal recovery conditions. The physician, being professionally wise, had not asked follow-up questions. He arrived every day at 2:30. He left at 4:15. In the 1 hour and 45 minutes between arrival and departure, he read. He read slowly, with attention, giving every passage the weight it deserved. He did the voices, a fact that would have ended his professional reputation entirely if his lieutenant Su Jin had not already known and chosen, out of something between loyalty and fondness, to permanently forget it. "You do the voices," Amara had noted during the 3rd visit, delighted. "The story requires them," he had answered, with great dignity. "The story requires a slightly unhinged narrator is what it requires." "The narrator is not unhinged. The narrator is committed." She had laughed. He had stored the sound of it somewhere internal and load-bearing. This was the rhythm of his days now, split cleanly in two. The hours before 2:30, during which he ran an underworld empire with the cold efficiency that had made him legendary. And the hours from 2:30 to 4:15, during which he sat beside a hospital window and read love letters to a woman who thought they were fiction. His mornings involved threat assessment, financial restructuring, and the occasional quietly administered consequence for professional disloyalty. His afternoons involved a worn notebook and the very careful management of his own expression. His advisors were, to put it with charitable understatement, concerned. Su Jin had raised the issue once, directly, which was the only way she raised anything. She had waited until they were alone in his office and then said, without preamble, The CO faction is testing the Eastern Distribution Network. They believe you're distracted. They are not entirely wrong. She had let that land before adding, with the careful neutrality of someone who had opinions she was professionally containing. The men are loyal, but loyalty runs on confidence, and confidence runs on visibility. They need to see you choosing the Empire. He had looked at her for a long moment. I am choosing the Empire, he said. I'm choosing it every morning from 6 until 2. The Empire can have its 6 hours. Su Jin had said nothing further. She was not a woman who repeated herself. What she did not say, because she did not need to, was that she had known him since before Changwol, since the years when the hunger in his chest had no outlet and the future was simply a longer version of the dock and the napkins. She had watched him build something extraordinary from nothing, brick by ruthless brick. And she had also watched him, 17 months ago, arrive at a hospital at 3 in the morning covered in someone else's blood, sit outside a surgical room on a plastic chair, and not move for 9 hours. She had brought him coffee he did not drink and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. And she had understood then, with the clarity of someone who had long suspected it, that the Empire was not actually the most important thing King Jaehyun had ever built. The notebook was. Outside in the corridor, on this particular Tuesday, a nurse passed the room and glanced through the small window in the door at the sight of Seoul's most feared crime boss reading aloud about cherry blossoms in a voice so careful and steady it could have been prayer. She had seen many things in this hospital. She would later tell her colleague that this was, without question, the strangest and most quietly devastating. Inside, Amara pressed her hand briefly to her sternum, the way she sometimes did mid-chapter, as if something in the story physically landed there. Are you all right? Jaehyun asked, pausing. She considered the question with the honest thoughtfulness that was entirely, unbearably herself. I think so. It just feels like... She stopped, frowned lightly. Like I've heard this part before, somewhere. He held the notebook very still. That's strange, isn't it? She said. Not strange, he answered, after a breath. Some stories just feel like memory. She accepted this and settled back against her pillow, and he turned to the next page, and Seoul continued outside the window, entirely indifferent, which was its habit. The notebook had 112 pages. Jaehyun knew this the way he knew the layout of every building his operation occupied, the way he knew the weight of a conversation turning dangerous before the other person realized they had shifted it, completely, precisely, without needing to count. 63 pages were filled. The remaining 49 were blank, which had once felt like possibility and now felt like a question he was not certain he had the right to answer alone. He had read 31 pages across 14 visits. At this pace, he calculated, he had approximately 6 weeks before he reached the last written entry. He had not yet decided what he would do when he got there. This was unusual. Kang Jae-hyun operated as a professional and personal principal, with contingencies prepared through at least 3 layers of eventuality. He was the man with the plan, inside the backup plan, and his enemies had learned this expensively. Yet here he was, the architect of Seoul's most organized criminal infrastructure, with no strategy for page 63. He found this humbling in a way that his enemies would have found enormously satisfying, which was why they were never going to find out. It was a Thursday when things shifted. He arrived at 2:30 as always, signed in at the nurse's station as always, volunteer program, reading initiative, 4th floor east, and walked the familiar corridor with the particular quality of calm that was not peace, but its convincing imitation. He had become, over these weeks, a fixture on the floor. The day nurses greeted him by a slight nod. The physiotherapy staff had stopped noticing him. He had achieved the underworld's most underrated skill, invisibility through consistency. Amara was not in her room. He stopped in the doorway. The chair by the window, his chair, though it was not officially his chair, though he had moved it precisely 4 inches to the left on his 3rd visit, and no one had moved it back, sat empty beside a bed that was neatly made and unoccupied. The afternoon light was doing its 3 o'clock gold thing to an empty room, which struck him as genuinely offensive. A nurse appeared at his elbow. She's in the garden, she said, with the tone of someone delivering information to a man who radiated the specific energy of someone accustomed to having information delivered promptly. The physiotherapist cleared outdoor mobility this morning. She's been out there since lunch. The hospital garden was a modest rectangle of greenery on the ground floor. more practical than beautiful, though someone had planted jasmine along the eastern wall that had opinions about its own importance and had largely succeeded in imposing them. Amara was sitting on a bench near the jasmine with her face tilted toward the afternoon sun, eyes closed, the expression of someone conducting a private conversation with warmth itself. He stood at the garden entrance for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually did. She heard him, or sensed the specific quality of stillness he introduced into spaces, and opened her eyes. "You're exactly on time," she said, which was not a question. She had noted, he realized, that he was always exactly on time. "I prefer punctuality," he said, crossing the garden. "You prefer control," she corrected pleasantly. "Punctuality is just the socially acceptable version." He sat beside her on the bench. "Those are the same thing." "They are absolutely not the same thing, and the fact that you think they are explains a great deal about you." She said this with the cheerful confidence of a woman stating observable fact, not landing an accusation. And he experienced the specific sensation he always experienced in her company, of being seen without being hunted, which was rarer than people imagined. He opened the notebook. "Can we stay outside today?" she asked. "I've been indoors for so long that I'd forgotten what uncontrolled air feels like." "Uncontrolled air," he repeated. "Air that hasn't been filtered, temperature adjusted, and quietly institutionalized. This," she gestured at the jasmine, the open sky, the distant sound of soul conducting its relentless business beyond the hospital walls. "This is air that hasn't been told what to do yet." He looked at her sideways. "You have strong feelings about air. I have strong feelings about freedom," she said simply. "Same thing." He opened the notebook to page 32 and read. The entry was from a Saturday in October 14 months before the attack. A day he remembered with the precise clarity of things that matter before you know they will matter. They had gone to a market in Namdaemun, and Amara had spent 20 minutes in negotiation with a vendor over a second-hand vinyl record of a Ghanaian high-life musician whose name Jae-hyun could not pronounce correctly no matter how many times she corrected him, which she had found progressively funnier with each failed attempt. She had won the negotiation. He had watched her do it. Warm, patient, absolutely immovable, and thought, this is what I look like from the outside. This is what it feels like to be on the other side of someone who knows exactly what they want. He had written that in the notebook that night, in his handwriting, on the right side of the page. Her response, written the following morning in her leftward tilt, read, "You watched me like you were studying for an exam. I kept waiting for you to take notes. For what it's worth, the record was worth every one. And so was watching you try to say Ebo Taylor 6 times in a row." Reading it aloud now, he altered his voice slightly for her entry, just enough distinction to signal the shift between narrators. He had done this from the beginning without being entirely conscious of it, and Amara had never commented on it until today. "You read her differently," she said quietly, when he paused at the page turn. He looked up. "The two voices are distinct characters. It helps the listener track." "No." She shook her head slowly. "You read him like someone telling a story. You read her like someone remembering one." The garden went very still in the way that gardens do when something true has been said inside them. "I think," Amara continued carefully, eyes on the jasmine, "that you know these people. Not the story, the people." He closed nothing in his face, which cost him more than she would ever know. "It's a well-written notebook," he said. "Good writing makes characters feel known." She turned to look at him then, fully, directly, with the unhurried assessment she had deployed on him that first day in the bookstore when he had been dripping on her floor. It lasted several seconds. "Okay," she said finally, softly, as though she had decided something. He did not ask what. He turned to the next page and kept reading, and the jasmine kept insisting on its own importance, and soul rumbled beyond the walls. And somewhere in the garden bench between their two carefully maintained distances, something that had been dormant shifted almost imperceptibly toward waking. Jaehyun had dismantled 3 criminal organizations, negotiated the surrender of 2 rival syndicate bosses, and once sat across a table from a man pointing a loaded firearm at his chest and talked him into putting it down using nothing but tone of voice and the precise deployment of silence. He had never been as frightened as he was on the Friday morning Soo Jin walked into his office, closed the door with the particular quietness that meant the news was significant, and placed a surveillance photograph on his desk without a word. The photograph showed the hospital entrance. Specifically, it showed a man Jae-hyun recognized, a mid-level CO faction operative named Baek, who had survived the post-attack purge by being sufficiently peripheral to escape notice, standing across the street from the hospital's main entrance with the practiced casualness of someone who had been trained to surveil and had not been trained quite well enough to do it invisibly. He was holding a coffee cup he had not drunk from in the 40 minutes the photograph covered. Amateur error. Professionals drink the coffee. It gives the hands something plausible to do. How long? Jae-hyun asked. We spotted him Tuesday, Soo-jin said. We ran a full perimeter check yesterday. There are two others, one on the south entrance, one covering the parking structure. They know she's here. They know you're here, Soo-jin corrected, with the precision that made her invaluable. She's leverage. You're the target. The distinction matters for how we respond. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Baek had chosen a position with a clear sightline to the main entrance and partial cover from a bus shelter, which suggested operational competence without genuine expertise. The CO faction was rebuilding after the losses he had inflicted in the months following the attack. Quietly, carefully, with the patience of people who had learned, expensively, not to move until they were ready. Apparently, they had decided they were ready. He picked up the photograph and set it face down on the desk. Increase her security detail, he said. Plainclothes, inside the building. I want someone on her floor 24 hours. No visible presence. I won't have her frightened. Rotate the perimeter team every 6 hours so the faces change. And I want Bake followed, not removed. I want to know who he's reporting to and how often. Soo-jin wrote nothing down because she never needed to. And your visits? He looked at her. They're watching the entrance, she said carefully. Your arrival pattern is consistent. 2:30, every day, same entrance, same duration. You've been a gift to any surveillance operation, frankly. I say this with respect and also with genuine professional despair. He acknowledged this with the slight tightening around his eyes that served, in his emotional vocabulary, as the equivalent of a wince. She was correct. He had been, in the specific context of protecting Amara, precisely as predictable as he had spent his entire career teaching others never to be. Consistency was a vulnerability. He had known this since he was 22. He had simply been unable to make himself care enough to vary the timing, because varying the timing meant sometimes arriving at 3 instead of 2:30, and that was 30 minutes of her afternoon he would not get back, and the math had seemed, in the private unguarded accounting of his actual feelings, unacceptable. He was aware of how this reflected on him professionally. He was choosing not to examine it directly. Vary the entrance, he said. Vary the timing within a 40-minute window. Keep the duration the same. He paused. The duration stays the same. Soo-jin looked at him with the expression she reserved for moments when she had opinions she had decided, on balance, not to voice. Understood, she said. After she left, he sat alone in his office for 6 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock, a habit from negotiations where silence had precise value, and permitted himself to feel, without managing or redirecting it, the cold, specific weight of what the photograph meant. They had found the only thing in Seoul that could be used against him. They had found it because he had not been careful enough, because he had allowed himself the daily luxury of 2:30 and the golden light in the notebook. And now Amara, who had already paid an impossible price for the misfortune of loving him, was in danger again. He thought about the garden bench. About you read her like someone remembering. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and went to work. What followed was, by the assessment of his senior operations team, one of the most efficient and quietly terrifying weeks Changwol had produced in 3 years. Jae-hyun moved through his empire like a system rebooting at full capacity. Cold, precise, everywhere simultaneously. The Eastern Distribution Network, which the CO faction had been testing, found its vulnerabilities sealed overnight by personnel reassignments that left no obvious pattern. 3 of the CO faction's financial conduits in the city were identified and reported through untraceable channels to investigators whose careers had been quietly shepherded by Changwol interests for years. Baek, the surveillance operative, was followed to a restaurant in Gangnam where he met with a CO faction coordinator, and everything discussed over their galbi was recorded with a device placed beneath the table 6 hours before their arrival. Jae-hyun listened to the recording at 1 in the morning in his car outside the hospital. parked in the structure on the west side, where the CO faction's third operative had been stationed and was no longer stationed, because that operative had received an anonymous message containing a photograph of himself that made entirely clear his activities were known, which had produced, with impressive speed, a career reassessment. The recording confirmed what he had suspected. The CO faction was not yet ready for a direct move. They were mapping. They were building a picture of his patterns, his vulnerabilities, his daily architecture. They had found the hospital. They had not yet found the full shape of why it mattered. He had, at most, a month before they did. He sat in the car and looked at the hospital's lit windows and thought about 49 blank pages and 6 weeks of reading, and Amara's hand pressed to her sternum as though something in the story physically landed there. He had told himself, from the beginning, that he was not telling her the truth because forcing memory was a kind of violence, because she deserved to come back to him, if she came back at all, by her own road rather than his insistence. This was true. He had believed it completely. He believed it slightly less completely at 1 in the morning in a parking structure with a surveillance recording on his phone and the CO faction rebuilding 3 kilometers away. He pulled out the notebook. He kept it with him always, had done since the hospital, a decision he had not examined too carefully because examining it would have required acknowledging how close to catastrophic its loss would feel. He opened it to page 63, the last written page. Her handwriting, the leftward tilt, from a night 3 weeks before the attack when they had sat on his apartment balcony watching the Han River lights, and she had written, as she sometimes did, in the present tense, as though writing to a future self. Tonight, he is quiet in the way he gets when something is too important to talk around. So I'm not talking around it either. I am here. He is here. The city is doing its usual dramatic thing below us. Whatever comes next, I want it on record that this, right now, is enough. More than enough. This is everything. He closed the notebook. He started the car. Tomorrow, he would arrive at 2:50 instead of 2:30 through the north entrance, and he would sit beside the window and read page 38. And Amara would make a comment about the narrator's commitment issues that would be simultaneously literary analysis and, without her knowing it, the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about him. And he would laugh, because she made him laugh, because she had always made him laugh, because some things survived everything. But tonight, in the parking structure, alone with the recording and the notebook and the cold weight of what was coming, Kang Jae-hyun allowed himself exactly 4 minutes of something that had no name in the language of powerful men. Then he put it away and drove back into Seoul, which was waiting, as always, for his full attention. The thing about secrets is that they have weight, not metaphorical weight, actual, physical, measurable weight that accumulates the way debt accumulates, quietly and then catastrophically, until the morning you wake up and the number is simply no longer compatible with the life you have been pretending to live. Jae-hyun had carried secrets professionally for years and understood their mechanics completely. You manage them through compartmentalization, through controlled information environments, through ensuring that the people who knew different pieces never occupied the same room long enough to assemble the full picture. What he had not accounted for was Amara assembling the picture entirely on her own. It began on a Monday. He arrived at 2:50 through the north entrance, nodded to the plainclothes operative station near the elevator bank. A compact, unremarkable man named Hyun Woo, who had the specific gift of looking like furniture, and took the stairs to the 4th floor because varying his movement patterns now extended to routes within the building. Soo-jin had suggested this. He had implemented it without argument, which had caused Soo-jin to briefly check whether he was running a fever. Amara was at her small desk by the window when he entered, which was new. She had been mostly bed-based or garden-based across his visits. The desk suggested energy. The desk suggested a mind that had decided passive recovery was finished and active occupation was required. He recognized this transition because he had seen it in himself at 22, and it had resulted, ultimately, in Chongwol. He was not certain whether to be encouraged or alarmed. On the desk was a legal pad covered in her leftward tilting handwriting. Beside it, 3 library books from the hospital's small patient lending shelf, 2 novels, and what appeared to be a music theory text she had clearly requested specifically because it was not on the standard lending list. And beside those, positioned with the deliberate casualness of something placed to be noticed, a printed list. He sat down. He did not look at the list directly. He had not survived Seoul's underworld by telegraphing his attention. "I've been doing research," Amara said, without looking up from the legal pad. "Into what?" he asked, with the tone of a man making polite conversation. Memory, she said. Specifically, post-traumatic selective amnesia following blast injury. She wrote something on the pad. The hippocampus is interesting. It doesn't store memories like a filing cabinet. It reconstructs them every time you access them, which means memory is always partly imagination, which means the line between remembering and feeling is significantly blurrier than anyone tells you. A brief silence. You've been talking to your neurologist, he said. I've been talking to my neurologist, reading 3 peer-reviewed papers I had my sister email me, and paying attention to my own experience, which doctors consistently undervalue as a data source. She set the pen down and looked at him. Did you know that emotional memory is stored differently from episodic memory? That you can lose the specific events, the dates, the details, the narrative, but retain the emotional imprint? Like the feeling survives even when the footage is gone. He held the notebook in his lap and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not be either a lie or an ending. I keep feeling things I can't explain, she continued, with a direct, unfrightened quality that had distinguished her from the first day he knew her. When you read certain passages, I feel, not memory exactly, more like the shape of something, like a room I've been in that I can't picture but my body still knows the dimensions of. She paused. That happens to me specifically during the sections written in her handwriting. The room was very quiet. And I've been looking at the handwriting, she said. She reached across the desk and picked up the legal pad, turning it to face him. On it, she had copied 3 lines in her own hand, and beside them, open to a middle page, she had positioned the notebook. The similarity was not subtle. It was not something that required forensic analysis or expert comparison. It was the same leftward tilt, the same particular loop on the letter G, the same habit of underlining for emphasis using a line that curved slightly upward at the right end. She had written her own handwriting next to her own handwriting and placed them side by side, and was now watching his face with the patience of someone who had already done the mathematics and was waiting, not unkindly, for him to confirm the sum. Jaehyun looked at the 2 samples for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Amara, I'm not asking you to tell me everything, she said quietly. I understand that whatever this is, whoever you are, to me, it's complicated in ways I probably can't fully access yet. My neurologist says forced reconstruction can be counterproductive. I'm not asking to be forced. She folded her hands on the desk with the composed steadiness of someone who had clearly rehearsed staying calm through this conversation and was succeeding through sheer discipline. I'm asking for one thing, one true thing. Just give me one true thing, and I'll take it from there myself. Outside, Seoul continued its relentless noise. Somewhere on the floor below, a physiotherapy session produced the muffled rhythm of institutional encouragement. The afternoon light came through the window at its 3 o'clock angle and made everything briefly, mercilessly golden. He had prepared, in the abstract, for this moment. He had imagined it arriving as a confrontation, dramatic, demanding, the kind of scene that forced a decision. He had not imagined it arriving as this. Her, composed and direct and entirely herself, asking not for the whole truth, but for one true thing, as though she understood that he was a man who had learned to release things slowly or not at all, and was willing, generously, to work within that architecture. This was so thoroughly, specifically her, that it cracked something in him that had been sealed for months. He set the notebook on the desk between them. He opened it to the first page, not a written page, the inside front cover, where, in the bottom right corner, in handwriting that was his and no one else's, were 4 words he had written the night she gave him the notebook, before a single memory had been recorded in it, when it was still just possibility, and leather, and her laughing at him for being sentimental about a blank book. 4 words. For when you forget. He had meant it as a joke. A small, private joke about his own famously poor relationship with sentimentality, a wry acknowledgement that he was the kind of man who needed things written down to believe they were real. She had read it and said, "That's either very romantic or very ominous." And he had said, "With me, generally both." And she had laughed. He had not understood, writing it, that it was a prophecy. Amara looked at the 4 words. Her finger moved to them without quite touching the page. "That's your handwriting," she said softly. "Yes." You wrote this before anything else was written in here. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. Her finger hovered over the words. Outside, soul. The light. The jasmine smell that had somehow followed her from the garden on her clothes. Were we? She started. Stopped. The composure she had maintained so carefully developed one precise crack, visible only in the slight change of her breathing. Were we happy? He did not hesitate. Extraordinarily, he said. She closed her eyes. Her hand finally rested on the open page, palm down, covering the four words gently. The way you cover something you want to keep warm. They sat like that in the golden light, the notebook open between them, soul loud and indifferent outside, and the secret that had been accumulating its impossible weight for months lifted. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough, just enough, for both of them to breathe differently than they had a moment before. He did not tell her everything. She had asked for one true thing, and he had given her one true thing, and she had received it with the grace that was, had always been, entirely and specifically hers. There were 49 blank pages still waiting. For the first time since the hospital, since the explosion, since the night everything changed, he thought that perhaps they were not waiting to be filled with the past. Perhaps they were waiting for what came next. The CO faction moved on a Wednesday. Jae-hyun noted this later, with the grim appreciation he reserved for irony that had genuine craftsmanship behind it. That the day which had given him everything, the rainy Wednesday in April when he had stood dripping in a bookstore in Mapogu and been corrected about a dead Chilean poet, was the same day of the week that someone decided to take it all away. The universe apparently had a sense of narrative structure. He did not find this charming. He was in his office at 11 in the morning when Hyun-woo called. Hyun-woo was not a man who called unnecessarily. In 8 years of working for Changwol, he had developed a reputation for communication so economical it bordered on the philosophical. He conveyed information in the fewest possible words, at the precise moment they were needed, and never before. When his name appeared on Jae-hyun's screen at 11:14 on a Wednesday morning, Jae-hyun answered before the second ring. 2 men, Hyun-woo said. Maintenance uniforms. 4th floor. They badged in through the service entrance 12 minutes ago. The badges are real, pulled from a legitimate contractor account. Someone inside gave them access. Jae-hyun was already standing. Her location. Room. I have Song positioned in the corridor, but these two haven't moved toward the room yet. They're at the nurse's station, asking questions. Friendly, professional, completely wrong. Wrong how? Maintenance doesn't ask questions, Hyun-woo said. They look at things. These two are asking about patient schedules. Jae-hyun was moving through his office toward the door, phone to his ear, jacket already on because he had not fully removed it since Monday, a fact Soo-jin had noted and chosen, wisely, not to comment on. They're mapping her routine. They want to know when she's alone. He pushed through the office door into the corridor where his driver was already waiting, because his driver had learned over years of employment that when Jae-hyun moved with that particular quality of purpose, the car should be running. Lock down the floor. Nobody in or out without my authorization. Move her to the interior room on the west side. No window access. Do not tell her why. She'll ask, Hyun-woo said. Tell her it's a maintenance issue, Jae-hyun said, with the specific humorlessness of a man who is aware of the irony and has no time for it. I'm 20 minutes out. He made it in 11. The 2 men in maintenance uniforms were gone by the time he arrived, which was professionally unsurprising and personally infuriating. They had left the 4th floor at 11:22, 90 seconds after Hyun-woo's lockdown order, which meant someone had signaled them. There was a leak. Not inside Changwol. He trusted his people with the precise, evidence-based confidence of a man who had built his organization on verified loyalty rather than assumed it. But somewhere in the hospital's operational structure, someone with access to the contractor badging system, someone who knew enough about the 4th floor's layout to brief 2 operatives in maintenance uniforms. He stood in the west side interior room, which smelled of industrial cleaning products and had a window overlooking a ventilation shaft rather than a garden, and looked at Amara, who was sitting on the edge of the relocated bed with the expression of someone who had been told it was a maintenance issue and had immediately understood it was not a maintenance issue. How bad? She asked. He looked at her. I'm not asking you to protect me from the information, she said, with a patience that had acquired, since Monday, a new quality, less the patience of a stranger being gracious, and more the patience of someone who had decided to stay and was therefore owed honesty. I'm asking you to give me the actual situation so I can make actual decisions. I am not a passive element in my own life, Jae-hyun. It was the first time she had used his name. She did not appear to notice she had done it. He did not point it out. Because pointing it out would have required a steadiness of voice he was not entirely certain he could guarantee. There are people, he said carefully, who have a long-standing professional interest in removing me from Seoul's operational landscape. They have recently identified that the most efficient way to apply pressure to me is through you. Today was reconnaissance. They were mapping your routine. They will not move directly until they have a complete picture, which means we have a window. He paused. A small window. Amara absorbed this with the focused stillness of someone running calculations. How small? Days. Possibly less. And your plan? I'm moving you tonight. Private facility, different district, registered under a name that has no connection to me or to you. My team will. I'm not asking about logistics, she interrupted, not unkindly. I'm asking what you are going to do while I'm in the private facility in the different district under the unconnected name. She looked at him steadily. What does Jae-hyun do? The question had a weight to it that was not purely practical. He had asked himself a version of it every day for months. What does Jae-hyun do? Now that the Empire and the Notebook and the Hospital Afternoon and the Golden Light and the 49 blank pages all existed simultaneously in the same life, and he could no longer pretend they occupied separate compartments. What does the most feared man in Seoul do when the thing he is most afraid of losing is sitting on the edge of a hospital bed in a room that smells of cleaning products, asking him direct questions with her own handwriting on both sides of a leather notebook? He finishes it, Jae-hyun said. The CO faction. He ends it completely this time, not partially. No more rebuilding. No more patience. It ends. And then? He looked at her for a long moment. That, he said quietly, depends on answers to questions I haven't asked yet. Something moved through her expression. Not memory, or not only memory, but something adjacent to it. Recognition without footage. The shape of a room her body still knew the dimensions of. Ask them, she said. He did not ask them that night, because that night was operational and brutal and left no space for anything personal. He moved Amara at 9 o'clock through a service exit in a vehicle registered to a catering company, to a facility in Seodaemun that Changwol maintained for exactly this category of necessity. She went without argument, which he suspected was less compliance than strategy. He was remembering with increasing vividness, a woman who chose her battles with the same precision he chose his. What followed across the next 72 hours was the most concentrated and methodical dismantling he had conducted since taking Changwol's leadership. The recording from the Gangnam restaurant had given him the CO faction's financial architecture. The maintenance uniform incident had given him their operational contacts inside legitimate institutions. And an intercepted communication, retrieved by a Changwol asset embedded in the faction's rebuilt hierarchy, gave him the name of the inside contact at the hospital, a facilities coordinator who had been receiving payments through a subsidiary account for 6 weeks. He did not destroy people carelessly. He had never been that kind of operator, the kind who burned broadly, who made examples for the sake of spectacle. He was surgical. He was documented. He was the kind of dangerous that left no visible marks and no viable recourse. The Seo faction's leadership received, on Thursday evening, a comprehensive package delivered through their own secure communication channel, which they had believed was unmonitored, which was the kind of belief that Jae-hyun found professionally insulting, containing evidence of financial crimes, regulatory violations, and operational activities that would be of significant interest to 4 separate government agencies. The package included a single unsigned note that read, "This is the complete set. I have copies. Retire." By Friday morning, the CO faction's 3 senior figures had each made urgent travel arrangements. The mid-level operatives, leaderless and suddenly aware that their organization's intelligence had been comprehensively penetrated, dispersed with the speed of people who have correctly assessed that the building is on fire. Hyun-woo called at 7:14 Friday morning and said, in his characteristically minimal way, "It's done." Jae-hyun was sitting in a car outside the Suodaemon facility. He had been there since 6. He had the notebook in his lap, open to the inside front cover. the 4 words visible in the early morning light. For when you forget. He closed it, got out of the car. Amara was awake when he arrived, sitting at the facility's small window with tea she had clearly made herself because waiting for people to bring things was, he was recalling with great fondness, not her natural mode. She looked at his face when he entered and read it the way she had always read him, with the direct, unhurried attention of someone for whom other people were genuinely interesting, rather than strategically relevant. "It's done?" she asked. "It's done." She nodded slowly. "Set down the tea. You look terrible." "I haven't slept." "You look like you haven't slept in approximately 4 months," she said, with the precise accuracy of someone who, he was increasingly certain, had been reconstructing a timeline. He sat down across from her. The notebook was in his hand. He set it on the table between them, the way he had on Monday, deliberately, with full understanding of what the gesture meant. "You said to ask the questions," he said. "I did," she agreed. Outside, Seoul was doing its Friday morning thing. Loud, relentless, entirely self-involved, utterly indifferent to the two people in a quiet room in Suadaemun who were about to have the most important conversation of their shared and partly forgotten life. He opened his mouth to begin, and Amara reached across the table and put her hand over his. Warm, certain, the gesture of someone who had made a decision, and said, quiet, "Memory," the neurologist had explained to Amara in careful clinical language, "does not return the way water returns to a glass, all at once, level, complete. It returns the way spring returns to a city that has endured a long winter, gradually, unevenly, in patches, with certain corners still cold long after the rest of the world has decided it is warm." Some mornings she woke with something vivid and specific, the smell of a particular restaurant, the texture of a notebook page beneath her fingertips, the sound of a voice reading in two distinct registers, and the way she had known, before she knew anything else, that the difference between them was the difference between storytelling and remembering. Other mornings she woke with nothing new, and learned to receive that with the equanimity of someone who had decided that what she had was already enough to work with. What she had was this: cherry blossoms, and a man who had sat beside a hospital window every afternoon for months and read her their story as though it belonged to two strangers, because her unburdened laughter had been worth more to him than any ending he could force. She found, upon full consideration, that this was an extraordinary thing to have. 3 months after the CO faction dissolved, quietly, completely, with the thoroughness that was Jaehyun's professional signature, Seoul produced one of its unreasonable October days, the kind that arrive like an argument against seasonal cynicism. Sharp blue sky, air that had not yet decided to become cold, light that came in at an angle that made even the city's grayer edges look considered. Amara was discharged from the Suadaemon facility on a Tuesday. Jaehyun arrived at 9 in the morning, which was not 2:30, but was exactly on time in every way that mattered. He was carrying the notebook. She noted this and said nothing about it because she had learned, was relearning in the particular way that felt less like recovery and more like rediscovery, that he carried things of value close to his body without drawing attention to them, which was, she thought, both a professional habit and a personality. "Where are we going?" she asked, at the car. He held the door open. "Mapo-gu." She stopped, looked at him. He had the expression he wore when he had done something he considered both obvious and slightly vulnerable, which on his face registered as a controlled stillness around the eyes that she was increasingly fluent in reading. "Jaehyun," she said. "The bookstore is still there," he said. "I made certain of it." She got in the car. Oh, Sora books had not changed in the ways that mattered. It had changed in the ways that time enforces regardless. The signage slightly faded. The jasmine that had colonized the doorframe, now fully committed to its takeover. A new arrangement of the front window display that suggested the current evening staff had opinions about thematic organization. But the narrow storefront still occupied its overlooked slice of Mapo-gu, with the comfortable stubbornness of something that had survived by refusing to acknowledge inconvenience, and the interior still carried the particular smell of old paper and accumulated reading that Amara had, she discovered upon entering, a fully intact memory of. She stopped just inside the door. "Oh," she said quietly, "not the memory of the bookstore, though that was present, immediate, recognizable the way her own handwriting was recognizable. Something else. Something that preceded the specific memory and underlay it the way a foundation underlies everything built above it. The feeling of a room her body had always known the dimensions of. She stood with it for a moment. Then she walked to the poetry section, which was where it had always been, in the back left corner beneath a window that gathered dust in a way that made the light through it look intentional. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found the Neruda, slim, slightly worn, shelved with the care of something that had been specifically requested not to be leaned on. Behind her, Jaehyun said nothing. I told you not to lean on him, she said, to the bookshelf, to the room, to the 17 months that lived in the pages between them. He's delicate. A silence. Then, with a roughness that had nothing to do with his voice. You remember that? I remember that. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the bookstore exactly where he had stood that first Wednesday, and the light was doing something unreasonable through the front window. And he looked, for the first time in all the months she had known and not known him, like a man who had put something very heavy down and was still adjusting to the unfamiliar lightness of his own hands. I remember thinking that you had no idea what to do with someone who wasn't frightened of you. I still don't, he said. I've chosen to consider it a growth area. She laughed. It came out fully, without the slight hesitation that had accompanied her laughter in the hospital. The laugh of someone who is not quite sure what they are laughing from. This was something older, something that knew its own source. He heard the difference. She watched him hear it. They stayed in the bookstore for 2 hours. The current evening staff, a young man with strong opinions about thematic organization, who had clearly not expected the store's first customers of the morning to be a woman in a light coat who knew exactly where the Neruda was, and a man whose suit cost more than the building's monthly expenses, retreated to a discreet distance and stayed there. With the instincts of someone who recognized that what was happening in the poetry section was not technically about poetry, Amara pulled books she remembered and books she did not remember and placed them on the small table near the window. Their table, she understood now, without needing to be told. Jaehyun sat across from her and watched her move through the space with the expression he had worn beside the hospital window, except that it was missing the careful management now, the professional containment. It was just the expression itself, unmediated, which was the expression of a man looking at the specific thing in the world that he would dismantle everything else to keep safe. She sat down across from him. The notebook was on the table between them. 49 blank pages, she said. Yes, we should fill them. He looked at her with the particular stillness that she was remembering with increasing specificity, meant he was feeling something too large for his usual vocabulary. Amara. Not with the past, she said. I know we can't. I know what I lost, and I know it may not all come back, and I have made my peace with that, mostly on the days when peace is available. She put her hand on the notebook, palm flat, the way she had in the hospital over the 4 words in the front cover. I mean forward. New pages. What happens after the part where the girl starts to remember? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Mapogu conducted its ordinary Wednesday morning business. Delivery trucks and school children and the particular percussion of a neighborhood that had decided, long ago, to remain itself despite the city's developmental ambitions. Rain had begun at some point without announcing itself, the soft, persistent kind that Seoul produced when it was not being dramatic, when it was simply being the city that it was, layered and relentless, and occasionally, in certain narrow streets, in certain overlooked districts, quietly beautiful. I have to tell you things, Jaehyun said. Things I didn't tell you before. About what I do, and what it costs, and what it has required of people around me. I didn't tell you everything the first time. I told you enough to be honest, but not enough to be complete, because there were things I wasn't certain you would. I know what you are, Amara said simply. I knew before. I chose before. A pause. The choice doesn't frighten me. The silence does. He absorbed this with the focused stillness of someone receiving information that reorganizes existing structures. Then he nodded. Once, with the complete and unconditional quality of a man who has decided something permanently. No more silence, he said. No more silence, she agreed. He picked up the notebook, opened it to the first blank page, page 64. The one that followed this is enough, more than enough. This is everything, and set it on the table between them. Then he placed a pen beside it, which he had brought, she realized, specifically for this moment, because he was a man who prepared for things he wanted badly enough to be afraid of losing. She looked at the blank page for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. She wrote in her left word tilt, in the present tense, as she had always written when something mattered enough to address directly to whatever came next. We are in the bookstore in Mapogu. It is raining the small rain. He is sitting across from me looking like a man who has just remembered how to breathe, which I understand because I feel the same. I don't have all of it back yet. I may not get all of it back, but I have this, the Neruda on the shelf where it belongs, and a notebook with 48 pages still waiting, and a man who read me our story every day until I found my way back to it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. She slid the notebook across to him. He read it. His jaw tightened in the way it did when something bypassed every professional defense he had built and landed directly. He picked up the pen. He wrote, in his handwriting, on the right side of the page, as he had always written, "For the record, I would do it again. Every afternoon, every page, every chapter. I would read us back to you for the rest of my life, if that was what it took. It is not a sacrifice when it is the only thing that makes sense. Also, you told me not to lean on the Neruda on the very first day, and I remembered it for 17 months, and I was never once going to tell you that because it would have confirmed things about me that I have a professional reputation to protect. Consider this my one act of voluntary vulnerability for the quarter." Amara read it. The laugh that came out of her was the best thing that had happened in that bookstore in 17 months, possibly ever. Certainly in the recent memory of the young staff member who had given up all pretense of discreet distance and was now simply standing at the end of the poetry aisle witnessing something he would describe later to everyone he knew as the strangest and most genuinely moving thing he had ever seen in a bookstore, which was a place where moving things happened with some regularity. Outside, the rain continued its quiet, unannounced persistence. Inside, Amara and Jaehyun sat across from each other at their table by the window, with 48 blank pages between them, and Seoul loud and indifferent outside, and the Neruda on its shelf where it belonged, and began, without ceremony, without a plan, with nothing but the accumulated evidence of a love that had survived distance and violence and silence and forgetting, to write what came next. Some love stories survive distance. The rarest ones survive forgotten memories. The rarest of all survive both. And then, on a rainy Wednesday morning in a bookstore in Mapogu, quietly, stubbornly, with great humor and no small amount of dignity, choose to continue anyway. She remembered. He stayed. The notebook has 48 pages left, and they're going to fill every single one. If this story moved you, if you believe that real love doesn't give up even when everything is lost, like this video right now. Subscribe because there are more stories like this one waiting, and you deserve every single one of them. Share this with someone who needs to remember that some things are worth holding on to. And leave a comment telling us, what was the moment you knew they were going to make it? Only the CO faction leaves without saying a word. Thank you for reading. The notebook is not finished. Neither are they.